I know what you're thinking. You want to watch the final part where the render is. I completely understand. But in this video, I'll tell you all about increasing the overall quality of your render, and I'll also drop some valuable tips on all subjects. Things like incorporating story, symbolism, history, but also modeling, sculpting, rigid body physics, decals, lighting, compositing, color grading, and much more. All this so that your renders can grow to the next level of artistry, especially if you're a beginner. This video will be structured so that at each beginning of a chapter, I give some information and then I'll just let the speed modeling play out, so you won't miss a thing. So let's cut the fluff and start with the actual tutorial. Modeling. I made a chandelier for this render because I wanted the room to look luxurious, and thus I added luxurious items, the chandelier being the most important of those. I used a blueprint and mainly used the cylinder for all straight parts, and I used a path for the curved parts. I find this to be the best practice for rare forms and curved shapes. In this place right here, you can give the path some geometry. I also use the 3D cursor extensively to make sure that I spawn new objects on the right place. So I select the part of the mesh right here, press Shift S and place the cursor to the selection. Then I spawn a new object and make sure it aligns completely with the previous part. Now, one modeling trick you might not know about is the following. I had to distribute one of these multiple times in a circle. So I placed my 3D cursor in the middle by selecting the chandelier, pressing Shift S and placing my 3D cursor on the geometry. This is the center. Then I counted the chandelier's arms and found that there were 6 of them. Now, a circle is 360 degrees. So if we want to evenly distribute the arms, we need to divide 360 by 6. And the outcome is 60. So I place the orientation to 3D cursor, then I select the arm and press R to rotate. Press Z and type 60. And here's the trick. We don't have to do this each time, but we can simply press Shift R multiple times to repeat the previous action. Now it will place all the arms without having to press Shift D, R, Z, 60 each time. So that's just a little trick. Now, another valuable time-saving trick is as follows. If you want to join all of these parts together, you'll find that it doesn't work, because a path and a mesh are not the same. So what we can do is either select all parts or select only the curved parts and right mouse click, convert to mesh. This applies all modifiers and turns everything into a mesh. Now we can join them together with Ctrl J. One final tip, you can make a mesh follow a path and array it. Just add an array modifier and a curve modifier. And in the curve modifier you have to select the curve you've made, and then you can increase the array to make it follow the curve. You might have to change the axis, and sometimes you have to press N and set all location data to 0. That's it for the modeling part. Now let's look at sculpting, because sculpting is a very lazy and easy method to increase the complexity of a mesh. So let's take a look at this chair. As you can see, it looks quite bland and uninteresting, but if we just sculpt some random forms into the chair, it will look a lot better. I made sure to enable the mirror so that it sculpts both sides simultaneously. That is basically how I made the entire chair. Start with a base shape and add detail to it either by modeling or by sculpting. Very quick and easy tricks to increase the quality of your render. Now for the texturing of this piece, I didn't do anything extravagant, like texture painting or stuff like that. I mainly use PBR textures, which I got from Ambient CG, and sometimes I use an image texture such as the one on the plate. I simply hovered over the plate, projected it from view and aligned it correctly. I did the same for the inside of the chair. Now let's have a look at the lighting of this scene, because I used one of my favorite lighting tricks, one that I also showed in my lighting tutorials. In Cycles we can use nodes on lights. This is great for if you want to use an IES texture, for example. I didn't use an IES texture in this render specifically, but I also used that often in my other renders. For this one I created my own texture. I added the Voronoi, decreased the randomization to 0 so that we'd have rectangular shapes, and then I used the color ramp to dial in the desired amount. As you can see, we now have extra texture on nearly every object. This serves the purpose of binding all objects together so that the entire scene seems more coherent than simply using a simple point light. Also, it adds a lot of texture for a minimal time investment. Great! Another great lighting trick is to use a black body node for the color instead of picking your own color. This makes sure that the light actually follows a Kelvin scale, just like actual lamps that you can buy in the store. A lower number makes it more reddish, while a higher number makes it more white. So I recommend using the black body node almost always, unless you have stylized lighting in your scene like a sci-fi render, for example. That's it for the lighting. Now for the symbolism I used two paintings, and both paintings were made by Peter Paul Rubens, an artist from the 17th century who made biblical art but also art from ancient mythology, mainly Greek and Roman. His art, to me, is some of the most beautiful in existence ever, and I recommend taking a few hours to check out his artworks. The painting I used on the left is the Fall of Phaethon. I'll tell a short version of the story, but look it up if you're interested. Phaethon was the son of Helios, and Helios pulls the sun wagon through the sky so that the sun always moves in the trajectory it does. Now one day, his son Phaethon wanted to ride the sun wagon too. However, he was haughty and prideful, which caused him to lose control of the sun wagon. He thereby almost scorched the earth and burned almost everything to a crisp. So to prevent this, Zeus killed him with a thunderbolt. In the painting we see Phaethon losing control of the sun wagon because of his pride. Beautiful painting, and it also adds to the story. Maybe our king here is prideful and aiming too high, causing him to be punished by the gods someday. The painting on the right, also made by Rubens, is the death of Decius Mus. This is a story from Livius, where the consul Decius Mus, basically a type of king, died in battle. Once again, a beautiful painting, and it signifies the death of a leader and a shift in power. You can see why these paintings add to the story of this render. So that's it for the story about the paintings and why I use these specific paintings. Let's now talk about some principles that have a great impact on your scene. Now, you see that the render is going somewhere, but it's still quite unsatisfying to look at. One principle that pretty much always improves your render is randomization. Nothing in the real world is aligned mathematically perfect. If these glasses are standing straight, you'll notice something's off, and that's because it's unnatural. The same goes for the height of the wine in the glasses. What are the odds that every wine glass on the table has the exact same amount of wine in them? Pretty much zero. Zero. What are the odds that all chairs are standing in the exact same line? Also very low. So be logical about this and think, what can I do to decrease the mathematical order? I also made a mess on the table on purpose, because the story allowed for it. The new king slaughtered his enemies, so we can imagine that there was chaos in the room before. People fighting and throwing objects. That's why I knocked the chair over right here, but also broke some plates and glasses to increase the chaos of the scene. Now of course, if you were making a different story in your art, don't just randomly break things. Make sure that it is logical for the story. You know what's funny? I also have a Blackmagic camera, and I shoot some movies with my friends to get better at cinematography. And the weird part is, we try to increase the orderly nature to make it seem slick, smooth and beautiful. However, in 3D, we try to decrease the order of things to make it look slick, smooth and beautiful. We can't attain mathematical perfection in the real world, and therefore even if we try, it will not work to make the real world look like a render. But in 3D, we try to move away from order a bit to increase the beauty of the shot. So that's something interesting to think about. The moral of the story is, increase the randomness of things in the scene, but don't make it entirely random. Be logical about it. Now the decals. Decals are basically transparent images that you can place in your scene to add detail for free. No modeling or texturing, simply add an image as plain and distribute it in the scene. This is how I made the blood, but you can also use decals for grime or dirt on the walls and stuff like that. So keep that in your arsenal as a useful tool to spice up your render with little to no effort. Next, the colors. I used gold, white and red mainly. There's some blue on the plates as well, and this is barely noticeable. But in cinematography there is a principle called the 60-30-10 principle. You may or may not have heard about this, but it states that the dominant color should be 60%, which in my case is gold. I also used the Kelvin on my lighting of around 3100 to get the yellowish look. Then I used white as a secondary color. It's on the plates, it's on the chairs and it's in the paintings. I deliberately wore a white blouse for all characters. The final color is used as an accent. This is the 10%. And I decided to go for red, because it's appropriate for this scene. The curtains, the wine and the blood. If we were to look at these percentages, we'd probably end up nearing the 60-30-10 rule. Not entirely, maybe there's a little bit more red. But we don't have to be stiff about following the rules to the dot. Just keep in mind that this is a principle of colors that you can use. Straight out of Blender, this image looks pretty bland and washed out. This is due to the nature of a filmic render. This is one of the most important parts of finishing your render, and if you're not doing this as of yet, I highly recommend installing DaVinci Resolve's free version or one-time paid studio version to improve your renders. So let's dive in, but use any program of your choice. In DaVinci Resolve I added the persons. I filmed myself multiple places and cut myself out using the polygon tool. I then masked parts of this render so that our persons can be placed behind these objects. I drew highlights on the persons, and I won't dive too deep into that because I've got short tutorials on all of this. But one thing I do want to tell is that I placed a bit of glow behind the main character, the king, once again to add contrast. Why? Well, because the king wears black and is seated in front of the light. It really makes him stand out. I accentuated this effect by adding a subtle touch of glow behind the king to increase the contrast, thereby drawing your eyes in even more. But that's it for Fusion right now. But let's look at the color grading process. I first normalize the colors of this footage. What does this mean? Well, I make sure that the highlights of our RGB are the exact same height. I also make sure that the midtones are at the same height, and I make sure that the shadows are at the same height. This neutralizes the footage a bit, and now we can work on our colors effectively. I want orange in the highlights and blues in the midtones, a typical color grade like the Transformers movie. So now, because we normalized our footage, we can actually separate the colors to make it not seem washed out, but separated. This makes it look a lot better. I also added a lens distortion effect, a film grain effect, and a bunch of other effects. But this is the basis of it. Let's first discuss the idea of story and symbolism in the render. Without the story, I reckon this render would not be as interesting. It would be more of an ArcViz render instead of an actual artwork. You get what I mean? Story is what gives it purpose, meaning and beauty. So let's go over some of the ideas I incorporated and why I did it. First of all, there's a historical motive. As we can read in Herodotus but also in Livius, banquets were a very popular way of betraying your enemies. They will have their guard down, and under the guise of goodwill and partnership, there were swords being sharpened behind their backs. One of those stories is told in Livius, or Livy in English, on the abduction of the Sabine women. The Romans invited their enemies, called the Sabines, to a banquet, and as the banquet ensued, they slaughtered the men and took their women with them. This is a popular story in the beginning of the Ad Urbe Condita, and it happened in the early stages of Rome, when there were basically no women in their tribe, but only warlike men. In order to build a civilization, they needed women for progeny, and thus they killed their enemies at the banquet. This render follows that historical motive, where a banquet is used as a political ploy to defeat enemies. On to the next part of the story. The king in the middle can be thought of either as a conspirator who had his enemies killed, or he became a king by killing his enemies. I don't tell you this, but you can think about it for yourself. And the fact that it lies open to your mind makes the story more interesting and invokes you, the viewer, to think about what happened here. And if you think about something, it enters your mind. And if it's in your mind, it impacts you. So, show, don't tell. Think about what this render represents for yourself. One other means of story is the contrast. Luxury, expressed in white and gold, seem clean, high and noble, while in this scene something terrible happened. This makes sure that there is a contrast in the environment to what is actually going on, and using contrast or subverting expectations in such a way makes for a great storytelling principle. So next up, the composition. We can achieve a lot by changing the camera angle and thinking about certain cinematic principles. Look at these lines, for example. They guide your eye towards the end of the table. Now look at these lines on the bottom of the painting. They point at the king in the middle. Then look at the last chairs. They are rotated in such a fashion so that the lines of the chairs, if we were to drag them out, point at the king. This was done on purpose to make sure that you look at the king in the middle first. Afterwards you see the rest, but the main composition or holistic perception of the render is crafted by design. You were meant to look at the king first, and I'm quite sure you did. So keep in mind that lines guide our eyes towards certain places, and we can use this to help the viewer see what is most important. So I hope this video was useful for you, so that you now know better how to make art in Blender, and what techniques to use in modeling, sculpting, story, symbolism, composition, lighting, compositing, and all the other things we spoke about. Thanks for watching, I hope you learned a lot, and if you did, I highly recommend watching this video next.